Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this panel, U.S. Sorry, one more minute. Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this panel, U.S. and Mexico today. Before we start, we're going to listen to the emergency protocol, medidas de seguridad.
Buenas tardes. Antes de iniciar, transmitiremos un mensaje de la Comisión Local de Seguridad de la Escuela. Nos encontramos en el Auditorio Rosario Castellanos. En caso de tener que desalojar este recinto, deberemos hacerlo de forma ordenada, conservando siempre la calma. Procederemos de la siguiente manera. Las personas que ocupan las primeras 5 filas deberán hacerlo por la salida de emergencia, ubicada a la derecha de este auditorio. De las filas 6 hacia atrás, lo harán por la puerta de entrada, saldrán de este inmueble y se dirigirán hasta el punto de encuentro que está localizado entre el edificio A de la escuela y el Centro de Investigaciones de Diseño Industrial, CIDI, de la Facultad de Arquitectura. Si alguna persona no puede desplazarse rápidamente, deberá resguardarse junto a las columnas, que son los lugares señalados como las zonas de menor riesgo. Les solicitamos seguir en todo momento las indicaciones de los brigadistas. Gracias por su atención.
First, on behalf of Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and Escuela Nacional de Lenguas Lingüísticas y Traducción, I would like to thank all of you for being here and extend my gratitude to our panelists for joining us. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from the English Teaching Assistants, or ETAs, who serve as cultural ambassadors of the United States and Mexico. Through their experiences and insights, they will discuss the present and future of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, delving into key aspects such as culture, economy, foreign policy, and education. In an increasingly interconnected world, the role of cultural ambassadors is more important than ever, as they help build bridges of understanding between our nations. Throughout this discussion, we will explore common misconceptions about both countries, examine the future of academic exchanges, and reflect on present geopolitical and economic issues that shape our bilateral relationship. We hope this panel provides valuable perspectives on the role of diplomacy, policy, and education in fostering mutual understanding. Our panelists today are Chloe Moss, is a Fulbright ETA at Instituto Politécnico Nacional Santo Tomás from Richmond, Virginia. They obtained their bachelor's degree in Spanish and International Studies with concentrations in peacebuilding and gender and sexuality studies. They served 3 years as Data Intake Supervisor at Justicia Alimentaria DMV, a DC-based nonprofit providing food and essential goods to immigrants in the DC metropolitan area. Last spring, they co-authored a policy paper for the U.S. Department of State outlining how U.S. manufactured weapons have been used to destabilize countries in Central America and the Caribbean. Then we have Jackson Ribler, is a Fulbright ETA from Miami, Florida, teaching at Zacatlan. He obtained his bachelor's in national security from Virginia Tech and his master's in Spanish from Georgetown University, writing his thesis on transnational cinema and lucha libre. His work experience ranges from the U.S. Department of State to the Office of the Mayor of Miami-Dade. Additionally, he served as a public affairs officer in the Civil Air Patrol, holding the rank of first lieutenant and graduating with distinction from the National Emergency Services Academy Mission Aircrew School. Now we have Brianna Rios. She is a first-generation college student from Los Angeles, California. At the age of 17, she served as an English and math teacher in India and Vietnam. Following that, she studied Spanish translation and literature in Spain. At the University of Southern California, she obtained her bachelor's degree in public policy and performing social change. During her undergraduate career, she interned from the Los Angeles City Council, where she worked on legislation regarding layered issues of homelessness, public health, and education, specifically focusing on Latin and Latino identity and accessibility to the sustainable development of the city. Throughout her academic career, she has taught activist theater and conducted her own research on the impact of community-centered performing arts. She is currently completing her second Fulbright ETA grant at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México in Nantes. And last but not least, we have Socorro Torres Lopez. She is a Fulbright Garcia Robles grantee, currently pursuing a master's in Mexico and United States studies at Nantes. A graduate in international relations and sociology from Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. Her academic interests focus on U.S. and Mexico bilateral relations, the American dream, and the evolving generations of Mexican Americans, a community to which she proudly belongs. Let's begin. Our first question goes for everyone. As cultural ambassadors, what do you think are the most common misconceptions of culture, economy, and foreign relations developed today? And how do these ideas affect the future of the relationship between Mexico and the United States?
Hi, I can get started. Well, my name is Brianna. Thank you all for being here. This is fine? Okay. Yes, so I think there's a few things. I think, being here for now 16 months, a lot of what I've seen with these misconceptions has been, yes, in the media, but also within interactions with my students, with host families. And a few of the things I see are this idea of the U.S. being just completely a wealthy country, and also, of course, we have the idea of the American dream. I come from a family of immigrants, and I think this is something that has caused a lot of hostility and resentment among communities of Mexican American individuals, both in Mexico and in the U.S. The American dream is an idea that is very much repeated and sold among our education system and also in the media, but I think it's a huge false statement, and it creates a lot of false hope for a lot of people. And of course, I think for me as a Mexican American individual, it's been a conflicting feeling of not understanding really what it means, but knowing that it meant a lot to my family. But being here in Mexico, I think having to share that part of my story has been very confusing. And I think for the second part of the question, how these ideas affect the future of the relationship is, I think it creates a lot of limited conversation. There's a lot of stereotypes of people who maybe are immigrants in the U.S. and have quote unquote left behind their Mexicanness, and that's not necessarily true. I think that comes with this idea of trying to assimilate to the American culture. It's not an easy thing to do. I've seen it in my own household. But of course that comes with a lot of guilt and a lot of also longing to be back. And that's something I've been understanding and exploring here in my time in Mexico. And I worry that these false stereotypes are creating a lack of conversation between families, among generations, and also in educational spaces. So I'm hopeful that we can kind of break and dismantle this idea that the American dream produces a certain type of Mexican in the U.S., because that's not the case. There's a lot of nuance to these stories, and I think that's something to consider. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe, and I'm an ETA at U.S. And for me, the thing that has been the most surprising is talking to my students and hearing them voice their beliefs that the United States is a white country. That's shocking for me. I grew up in a very, very diverse community. My family is the only white family on my street. And so for me, I see how beautiful the diversity in the United States is, how much that has impacted so many aspects of, here, let me move closer, so many aspects of life within the United States. Going to Socorro's point about the United States not having any culture, I am from the South of the United States, where so much of our food and our music has been influenced by various countries and communities in Africa who arrived through slavery, but also through immigration from England, from Great Britain in general, from Ireland, from other places in Europe. And yes, those are white countries, but as the communities mix together, we see this incredible explosion of diversity in culture that is very specific to not only each region of the United States, but each region of each state itself. So to say that the US is only white, that we only like hot dogs, we only eat hamburgers and watch baseball, is to ignore millions of people and centuries of history throughout the United States.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Jackson. I teach at Fazakadlan. I first wanted to touch on misconceptions that we in the United States have of Mexico. I love media, I love television, I love movies, and there is kind of like a troubled relationship with our representation of not just Mexico, but of Mexican Americans. So I'd like to bring to our attention like maybe two phenomena that are kind of interesting. One is, we have this habit of kind of orientalizing Mexico. Edward Said talks about how in the West, we have this habit of condensing the Orient and blending cultures together. And in the United States, I think for a lot of people, the conception of Mexico is very much the borderlands and frankly, Yucatan, Cancun. And the Mexico that's much more urban, urbanized, and maybe more progressive and less traditional is often ignored in our portrayals of Mexico. And pardon. The second thing I'll bring up is, as part of this kind of condensing Mexico into just Yucatan and the North, is I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of this sepia tone filter phenomenon that goes on in the United States. For those of you that are fans of Breaking Bad, the characters are in the United States. They're in the Southwest. It's very hot. They're in the desert. They've entered into Mexico, into a part that has the exact same climate, and suddenly it's yellow. An interesting thing about this is it really reduces, Mexico is a very green country, even in the north. There's a lot of vegetation, and I think a lot of Americans don't realize how resource-rich Mexico is in terms of vegetation, food, mining, and as a result, I think a lot of Americans have this idea that Mexico does not have resources and it's sort of a barren place. And it's not that Mexico is without resources, it's that those resources are maybe overexploited or sent to other places. And I think that these like narrative frameworks in the US really do a lot to distort our vision of Mexico. And to a point that like Mexico City is not a consideration for a lot of Americans thinking of Mexico. As far as like Mexican misconceptions of the United States, I work with a lot of very brilliant international relations students at my university, a lot of whom have this very vigorous attempt at putting the US in terms I've just used like East and West, global North, global South. And I think that, there certainly does exist conflict between nations that are developed, underdeveloped, or in these terms. But I think this ignores kind of to Chloe and to Ree's point that within the United States, we have other drivers of conflict and tensions that are racial, that are class-based, that are gender-based. And, as a result of this kind of analysis of North versus South that I see is very popular in Mexico, I think that a lot of Mexican civil society and diplomats enter kind of on the back foot. And I think that in entering into these negotiations on tariffs and on border security, you all as maybe aspiring diplomats, civil society people, advocates for your country would do well to understand the internal divisions and tensions within the United States that bring us to the negotiating table. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for sharing with us your perspective about misconceptions. We can clearly identify how stereotypes and misconceptions are sadly everywhere, but that's why we're here, right? So to continue with this panel, our next question will be, with the recent declaration of English as the sole official language of the United States, do you think there will be a change in the dissemination or teaching of other languages and or that English will be preached of loanwords from other languages?
Sure. So I'll take this one first. To address the part on loanwords, I do not see loanwords being purged from English as they are ingrained in the English language. But in terms of how teaching will change, I do expect to see a shift in how foreign languages are taught in the U.S., especially with the recent dismantling of the Department of Education. My guess is that it will likely become more similar to a states' rights issue, where states have the ability to decide which foreign languages they teach, if any at all. And I do expect to see certain states cut or outright ban certain foreign languages, but I don't expect these changes to be all-encompassing or permanent. And Trump's implementation of English as the national language, it is more direct than his predecessors, but it's not too far off from what other presidents have done. So if we look at 2001, George Bush's policy of No Child Left Behind, this gutted an act called the Bilingual Education Act, which had existed for decades before, and prioritized the teaching of English in schools. So schools were encouraged to not develop students' native languages if they were not English, and it severely reduced funding and accessibility for bilingual programs in schools. So the suppression of foreign languages may become more standardized or more common throughout the United States, but many of the systems that will support that change are already in place.
Okay, I'll try to talk a bit louder. So I'm going to talk about the governmental implications that this has. So English being declared the official language means that official standard business now has to be completed in English. So this means, it doesn't mean that it's not mandatory for these forms to be given in English anymore, but it does mean like that they're not obligated to give them. So if an organization, like we've seen with the Diversity Inclusion Act, it means that for school registrations, driver's licenses, requests for healthcare services, their forms might only be provided in English now. And it being no longer mandatory could have also implications for K-12, which is where we see more parental involvement with children through the paperwork and registering for classes. And as of now, there hasn't been anything said about, like Chloe was mentioning, dual language education. Like right now, it's not been affected, but in the past, we have seen it be affected. So it does mean they're now put more in danger than they would have been prior to Trump's declaration. And this is particularly harmful for citizens who do navigate their life in the U.S. through their native language, because a lot of times you can do the citizenship exam in your native language. You don't have to do it in English. And it does also mean that culturally language is becoming more of a divisive factor than we've seen it before. And I also agree with Chloe in terms of purging languages. I don't foresee this happening immediately. Language is culturally embedded, and the U.S. is too diverse to make a general claim, but even in states like Florida or Texas that are red states and have large populations of Spanish-speaking populations, thus language wouldn't change immediately. And I think this is a reason for concern, but we've also seen that there's pushback on behalf of advocacy groups to keep foreign language avenues available. And it's also alleviating to know that the executive order does not demand that this access ceases to exist. It just no longer makes it mandatory.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Within the same field of education, our next question will be, will the positive exchange policy between the two countries continue for specialized master's and doctoral studies?
this first question. So without a doubt, under the Trump administration, this relationship is definitely under attack right now. As my colleagues have said, we have the dismantle of the Department of Education. But as we all know here, America's education sector is a major employer, with international students being a crucial factor for many universities' financial health as well. And unfortunately, with that, education may ironically become a tool for leverage in the future trade wars or diplomatic disputes. However, I think this is where we can look to universities understanding this dynamic currently and taking it under their own hands to understand and advocate for the sector's economic significance and the role that international students truly play in sustaining academic excellence. Many groundbreaking research labs rely on the expertise of foreign-born students, underscoring their essential role in innovation in the U.S. Essentially, international students are vital to the greatness of innovation, economic pursuits, and employment in many of American sectors, but also in the universities themselves. And we must confidently communicate this reality. Another aspect I want to touch on is this idea of the fear that has been really produced because of these policies. So because there are these really uncertain policies of what their programs might look like for 2 or 3 years to come, a lot of students in other countries are now less likely to pursue a master's degree in the U.S., unfortunately. We can speak on our experience with the Fulbright program. Me as an ETA, there is a current status that the program next year will be cut in half, which means the ETAs coming to Mexico are going to be less, and we don't know what that looks like in other countries. So yes, I think to answer the question in conclusion, there is a fear, and there is something that is happening that is declining this relationship. But this is why, in my opinion, I think we need to look at the universities themselves, because there's people in these spaces that are still advocating for international activity, and also for advocating for the students who are coming from other countries as well.
I can speak on the programs. So we were recently told that those who start in Mexico this year will be able to come back next year. It's a 2-year program. I'm in my 2nd year, so for me, it doesn't affect me. In the case of Mexico and Fulbright, Mexico has a commission, which means we're sort of protected in a sense because our funding is already allocated. And that means that for next year, they can still give grants, like Brianna was saying, it's just smaller scales. And I think for the next 2 years, the graduate programs are guaranteed, but there's no word on what will happen prior to the funding that they've already allocated.
Okay, and to add a little bit more in this question, how does that make you feel? I mean, could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think especially being here, a lot of us have been very anxious just because of this idea. I mean, across the board, the Trump administration has caused uncertainty for people abroad and, of course, in the U.S. And I think what has happened with our context of being in Fulbright, the work that we're doing is really important to us. And I think, I mean, I see some of my students here. Like, I think these conversations I have every day, I think it's important, but there's days when it makes me feel unmotivated and like sad to think that this work is I'm not backed up by the work that I'm doing by my country. So it is a little scary, but I do think, like I said, there is hope in these educational programs that still exist in the private sector. And of course, as we mentioned, like across the states, this is where state power and educations across different states is going to be super important to look at, because we still have that, and we still have the advocacy for international engagement, because it's super crucial, especially with everything else kind of being inhibited and limited. There is still conversations happening in educational spaces. So I'm hopeful, but there are days when it does make me anxious and a little bit confused about the work that I'm doing as a cultural ambassador.
I think it can be disheartening just because I grew up in an area with a lot of Mexicans. So I think when you study Mexico-US relations, it's really important to understand both characters at play, and being able to study in Mexico City for 2 years has permitted me to see what it is like to live in Mexico, what life is in Mexico. And it also helps you break down all of these ideas that you grew up with in the US, you know? And I think it's necessary for Americans to come to Mexico, especially if you already have this idea of what Mexico's like. And I think taking these opportunities away is a step backwards for the bilateral relationship. And what we need right now is to be amending this relationship. So I'm definitely hopeful with the fact that the program will still be around and it's not being dismantled like many other programs currently are. But I do hope that hopefully once Trump is out of office, the program can be reinstated to the amount that it has been, just because I talked to other Fulbrighters and a lot of them talk about how Fulbright has changed significantly their perception. I think it also helps for us to be here and talk sort of like we're doing now, and it changes this idea of what Mexican Americans are, or how we all grow up very differently. Like I think with any Mexicans, you know, I've met more Mexican Americans in Mexico than I did ever in Florida. So it is a little sad, but I'm also hopeful that there's still a lot of people who care and want to learn.
Thank you. Jackson?
Yeah, I would just say it's, I think, this administration's, lack of reverence for international aid and international education mirrors very much their irreverence for education internally within the United States. I think this current administration is very transactional and it thinks very short term. It asks itself the question, what is the benefit of giving more resources to an impoverished neighborhood for their education? What do we get by sending Jackson to Mexico to teach English grammar? And they kind of ask this question, and to me, and I think to a lot of other people, it's simply intuitive. We do this because it's the right thing, because it's a good thing, because learning languages is an incredible privilege that is oftentimes expensive and out of reach. And it's just something we should do for our neighbors, regardless of asking for something super deep in return. So I just kind of wanted to say that.
Thank you. Let's be hopeful then, because as you've mentioned, learning a language isn't just learning the language itself, it's also learning about culture and social cultural norms and stuff like that. So let's be hopeful in this part. Now, moving on to the conversation. This is related more to the economic bill. With tariffs imposed on countries such as Mexico, Canada, and China, the cost of foreign products in the U.S. would increase. Do you think that by raising the cost of these products for Americans, consumer habits will change so that Americans buy more products within that country?
So almost definitely consumer habits are going to change, but I do not think it's going to lead to people buying more within the country. Pre-tariffs, salaries were not rising at the same rate as goods. Inflation has hit people in the United States very hard post-pandemic. And so now goods that were already incredibly expensive will be even more expensive. So first, I believe people will stop buying luxury goods with a more elastic demand. I think people will generally buy less, but I also think that this will affect goods that have generally a less elastic demand, that people typically will continue buying no matter how much it costs. And that's things like groceries, right? We've seen egg prices quadruple in the United States. Poultry it's ridiculous. You can't afford it, truly. Like a family on a minimum wage salary cannot afford their own groceries. And that is what causes a recession, right? And autarky in general, or the idea of a country only consuming what it produces, has proven to be an economic failure time and time again throughout history. We can look at Spain during the Franco dictatorship when they tried autarky and the situation got so rough that people could not eat. Almost the entire country was on food stamps. And the way that they were able to bring money back into Spain was to open up the country to tourism. So it is now a tourism-dependent country, which I think most people in this room know is never a stable economy. And it does not work. Autarky does not work. A few years ago, I think 2 decades ago, a museum did an experiment called the 100-mile suit, where they decided they wanted to make a suit with only using artisans and products that came within 100 miles of the museum. The suit ended up costing 5 times more than a suit made in a global economy would cost. It was of much worse quality and lasted for way less time. So all of that is to say that globalization has extreme problems, of course, but it is never, never good to completely recede from the global economy if you are looking to maintain stability and equality of goods, which is what people in the United States have come to expect. This is going to hit citizens of the U.S. very hard.
And I think it already is hitting hard with other countries implementing their retaliatory tariffs, such as Canada against the liquor industry in the United States. I wanted to echo a few things. I also just wanted to say tariffs were something that were kind of taboo or almost unspeakable. And in this way, the Trump administration is really breaking from decades of consensus amongst economists. Most Americans with living memory will recall that the Great Depression was largely put onto us because of the Holly Smoot tariffs in the 1930s. And also, so the question was, do we think that if we have more tariffs, that American consumers will be more motivated to buy goods manufactured in the United States? And I think no. I think the consensus is that American consumers will simply consume less, both foreign and American-made products. I think there are some industries, such as certain types of manufacturing, automobile manufacturing, that the United States, even with tariffs, does not have a competitive advantage in. And ultimately, a lot of these United States manufactured goods are reliant on other goods in the supply chain that come from other countries. And as a result, US manufactured goods, which are already expensive, will simply become even more expensive because it's not as though they're not connected to the global economy. So, yeah.
Okay, so one of the main reasons for imposing these tariffs was to control the flow of fentanyl into the United States. That's what it said. Do you think Mexico or the Mexican government is primarily responsible for the cartels and therefore primarily responsible for the distribution of narcotics in the United States? What is your opinion on this topic?
So absolutely not. Mexico is not primarily responsible. This is not to say that there is not corruption in the Mexican government, but I spent last year researching how the US fuels violent crime in Mexico. And ultimately, the main problem is the United States' unregulated overabundance of weapons. This is what arms the cartels. And not just in Mexico, all throughout Central America, throughout the Caribbean. So until the US government seriously registers and regulates the sale of weapons, especially military-grade arms, it is not fighting to end violence in Mexico. It is not fighting to stop the drug trade. So fentanyl right now is a hot button issue, or it is it's an easy topic to talk about in the United States to get people scared. But various studies have actually shown that fentanyl is less prevalent in the United States and less deadly than public opinion suggests. The United States media and politicians are using fentanyl to scare a population and taking that fear and placing it on Mexico. That is not where it belongs. Of course, fentanyl is dangerous, but it is only the current drug of national focus. So we can think about cocaine in the 1980s. Crack cocaine was the big fear in the United States, that cocaine was coming up through the border and that we were having crack babies addicted to cocaine. That was not the case. After that, it became marijuana. Marijuana is flowing through the border and everybody is sick and our children don't go to school anymore and they're going to become addicted to harder drugs. And that is not what happened. And now that marijuana is legalized in the United States, they needed to take that fear-mongering that has existed for decades and decades and place it on a new drug. And that new drug has become fentanyl. But the markets for both weapons and for drugs is based in the United States. And our economy is so deeply tied to that of the cartels, right? Like the United States citizens are the ones who are buying these drugs, whatever they be. Avocados, avocado farms that are owned by cartels. Those are being sent to the United States, and United States citizens are buying those avocados. There's a new sort of scam happening where the cartel is selling condos to older Americans, and then Americans end up directly paying the cartels for timeshares, right? It is US dollars that fuel cartels. And so it is US dollars who are fueling this violence and who fuel the drug trade. So it is up to the United States to regulate its own markets and regulate the sale of weapons, because weapons are what keep the cartels in power. And the vast, vast majority come from the United States.
Yes, completely agree. I just want to add more on the topic of the historical relevance of using Mexico as a political weapon. I'm gonna read an excerpt from an article just to kind of show how this has been masked in media, as Chloe mentioned. Again, to answer the question, absolutely not. It is not. It's not on the fault of Mexico. There is a demand, and Mexico is feeding that demand in the U.S. So let me read this excerpt. It's from the Council of Foreign Relations, and it's showing just how like coherent it's supposed to kind of perceive in terms of media, kind of putting that fault on Mexico and not on the U.S. So the United States has partnered closely with its southern neighbor in this fight, providing Mexico with billions of dollars to modernize security forces, reform its judicial system, and fund development projects aimed at curbing irregular migration. Furthermore, Mexican drug trafficking organizations, sometimes referred to as transnational criminal organizations, dominate the import and distribution of cocaine, fentanyl, heroin, marijuana in the United States. So clearly, it's kind of painting this image that they are the primary, dictators of this. When in reality, there's a historical idea that has to be taken into account. As we've seen in the 80s, it was the same rhetoric when this drug war happened. It's putting this blame, and it's also used as a political tool in alignment with the migration story as well in running a political campaign. Because there's drugs coming in from Mexico, we also must deport people. And this is another misconception relating to the first question that is super, super problematic to our relationship because it imposes also this image of Mexicans being solely part of the drug war. That's not the case at all. So I think it's important to look at the media, and as Chloe mentioned, also understand that it's not just between these two countries, and as well, China is also a big producer of fentanyl, and we're not looking there because in terms of foreign relations, it's in the U.S.'s best interest to partner with China and blame on Mexico. So I think it's important to look at the political strategy as this, and really understand that it damages the self-implication of what it means to be Mexican and what it also means to be a person in the U.S. So kind of relating my answer to the first question as well, but I think it's important to look at the political aspect.
And then, I wanted to briefly add, so we're talking about the question of responsibility, and it's important to ask ourselves, why is the United States one of, if not the largest market for drugs and the largest country that consumes drugs? And I think a lot of people would point to the fact that we have large gaps in our healthcare system, which is heavily privatized, and the fact that a lot of people can't afford to get prescription, legal drugs is the reason we have a lot of people self-medicating and taking illicit drugs like fentanyl. And I also wanted to caution you guys against overestimating the importance of fentanyl specifically with these tariff discussions. As we were saying, this is also a question that has to do with China. President Trump isn't only threatening tariffs against Mexico, but also against Canada, Colombia, Panama. And so I believe that this discussion of tariffs with President Trump began before fentanyl was kind of put into the conversation. And I worry sometimes here in Mexico, fentanyl is obviously a very big problem in both of our countries, but there is also like a government campaign of awareness and consciousness about the fentanyl problem. In the city here, we see kind of posters everywhere or like LED signs talking about the fentanyl epidemic. I believe 2 months ago, President Scheinbaum posted on her Instagram footage of drug addicted people kind of meandering around San Francisco and saying, I believe she said something interesting to the effect of like, we don't want this problem in the US to come to Mexico. So I think it's also important to realize that we're getting two different streams of information. And again, not to downplay, clearly the fentanyl epidemic is quite a problem, but sometimes I worry it is a bit of a red herring or a talking point in these discussions.
In this same sense, do you think the intervention of U.S. military forces in Mexico is the solution to this problem?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna take this very fast. I feel my other panelists have more eloquent answers. But no, as previously stated, the US's role in this fight lies on the US side of the border. Military intervention would exacerbate and create problems that either were not as bad before or simply didn't exist.
I'll just also add like a quick.
Also add like a quick answer with that, but no, it's something that, to my point before with political strategy, I do think it's a way to mask the actual intervention. It's a way to say, well, we're not in there, we're not intervening at all, when in reality that's exactly what they're doing. So I would say that in a way it's, yeah, I'm gonna stop there. We can have another answer.
Sure. So first of all, I'll say that I think a lot of Americans are against this, myself included, for moral reasons. But then on top of this, there may be like strategic and political reasons why traditional US military intervention in Mexico in a cartel war is unpractical. Part of this is that, if US military intervention destabilized countries far away, such as Iraq, such as possibly we could say Syria, Afghanistan, we have no reason to think that US military forces would be a stabilizing force here in Mexico, whereas the cartels are, first of all, much more differently and much more, to begin with, embedded into parts of the Mexican economy. And secondly, the United States military has struggled in our recent wars since the end of the Cold War to fight against non-state actors such as ISIS, the Taliban, and I have no reason to believe that the cartels would be an easier non-state actor for the US military to oppose.
Okay, thank you. So you're mentioning like all this kind of part of a political agenda, right? Do you think this bears any resemblance to the interventions the United States has had throughout history in countries such as Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and Iraq?
Sure. So I thought this question was very interesting, that it focused on US interventions outside of Latin America. Because when I first read it, my thought was that we don't have to leave the Americas to think about how similar this US intervention would be to previous US interventions. So of course, what came to mind was the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, which was the United States government deciding that it was in charge of taking care, in quotation marks, of the rest of America from originally European intervention. And that is what leads to our annexing of Puerto Rico, right? 1898, Spanish-American War ends. The United States takes Puerto Rico as sort of a way of protecting it from being re-invaded by the Spanish. We then assert our own political and economic influence over Puerto Rico, demand that they can only really be trading partners with the United States, and eventually forcefully incorporate it into a part of the country. That was all done in the name of freedom and maintaining stability, right? You can then think about the entire 20th century, the United States' relationships with almost every single country, with Mexico, with Guatemala, with Nicaragua, right? And our desire to stabilize, quote unquote, countries To prevent the spread of communism, we shifted from saying we are anti-European to saying we are anti-communist. But the reality was that the United States was looking for puppet governments, right? Malleable allies who would be sympathetic to U.S. interests and desires. And this, to me, this potential intervention of the United States in Mexico is an extension of that, where originally we were anti-European. I say we, the United States government was anti-European. Then it was anti-communist, and now it is anti-drug, right? It's anti-cartel. And so all of these steps were taken in the name of stabilizing a region, again, in quotation marks, but it is really just the United States government specifically, attempting to assert its own interests in another country. So let me just add one more. This rhetoric, as I wrote down, would be a political tool for the U.S. to exert power over a political rival, which theoretically would be the cartels, but in reality would be the Mexican government itself.
Yeah, so I'll add a few things to that. And then we don't even have to leave Mexico. As we know, the United States has had 2 military conflicts with Mexico, one being the Mexican-American War, the second being the Pancho Villa expedition during the Mexican Revolution. So, but as far as similarities with Iraq and Afghanistan and the wars in the Middle East, I would say one similarity is after 9/11 in the United States, there was a lot of media and a lot of campaigns to get people really thinking about this all the time. And there was this, what we call manufacturing of consent, and a large campaign to persuade the American population that WMDs and Saddam Hussein in Iraq were a threat to Americans sitting in their living rooms in Kansas and Florida and what have you. And I see this, my parents watch the television a lot, the nightly news, and they're very anxious people. And there is kind of a sensationalism or a similar exercise of manufacturing consent in pushing to them that the cartels present a clear and present danger to them that might involve, that, you know, might beg an intervention. I would also add, I've kind of heard in some circles with policy and with government, people popularizing the term narco-terrorism. The term narco-terrorism is super interesting because in the first place, the word terrorism in the United States has evolved radically. When we're first talking about the word terrorism, we're talking about state violence, government violence, authoritarian regimes, such as the Nazi government. And then during the Cold War, terrorism turns into this term to describe the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese forces and other sort of, you know, socialist, communist, guerrilla groups in Latin America. And today, of course, now terrorism with this kind of hyphenation is being affixed to the narcos and to the cartels. And again, I want to stress this idea that America is really not well suited to fighting against entities that are not states or governments, things like the cartels, which are much less. They clearly have a hierarchy, but they also have a lot of competition within each other, and there's no clear singular authority or primacy of a state. So, yeah.
Okay, so far we've discussed different areas such as education, government, and politics, right? I want to ask you a last question, and then I believe we'll have some time for our audience to ask you some questions, if that's okay. Well, this question is, how has being a part of Fulbright changed or impacted your perspective of the relationship between Mexico and the U.S.?
Excellent question. It's been, I'm gonna give it a lot of thought, but absolutely, it's changed my entire perspective. I grew up in a Mexican-American household, and I always felt that I didn't understand that side of the generational trauma, but also the cultural relativity that was incorporated in my home that I had to transfer to the education space. That was very confusing for me in many moments. My first language is actually Spanish, and I was in ESL for 4 years of my childhood and my primary education. And I think this idea of assimilation, as I mentioned in my first response in the first question, this does take a toll on Mexican families in the U.S. And I think this is another internal aspect that happens with a lot of immigrant families that is not discussed often enough in the U.S. And so I do think being here now for 16 months in Mexico and also various parts I was living in Aguascalientes last year, now being in Mexico City, the idea of diversity and the conversations I've had with my students on what it means to be Mexican American, and what it means to be from the US has also been something that I've come more in tune with by having these conversations. And I do think, so a major reason I applied for this program was because of these questions. And I asked myself regarding what does it mean to be Mexican American, because as well, there's this generational gap that happens with immigrant families that oftentimes don't want to share these traumas and these aspects of leaving something behind. And I think to understand this was something super conflicting as a kid. Especially when I entered higher education, I sought out more of my Mexican side, ironically. I thought I had completed this idea of assimilation. And when I entered the higher education space, I wasn't American enough. And again, this other extensive question of what is it to be an American? Throughout various moments, I realized that there is not just one thing. It's not just one thing. There's a lot of nuance to this. And I think being in Mexico, I felt super, at the beginning, if you were to ask me this question in 2023, when I first got here, I would have said that I had no idea what it meant to be American because I was so obsessed with trying to fulfill this role of being Mexican enough with coming back to Mexico. But now I think I can answer that question and say that I'm both. And they're going to be present in various moments of my life. Having these conversations like this and how we're doing today has made me understand the role that I play as being from the US, but also the historical memory that my family and me here as the English teaching assistant also holds. So I'll end with this that I wrote a little bit before, but after my months here, I can say that I do not have the answers or solutions to this confusion, but the ability to comprehend the nuance and embrace the beauty of it. My accent and all, which some of it I get asked about all the time. And Mexico was always a part of me, and throughout this time, I've been given the opportunity to understand this on my own terms and simply accept that I relate to both facets of the US and Mexican culture, and that perhaps these dual parts of me will be active and present in different spaces that I enter, and that is completely okay. In fact, it's a hybridity that I alone can define and I continue to embrace throughout my life. Moreover, asking myself these critical questions has allowed me to also engage in dialogues regarding this complicated relationship between U.S. and Mexico, one of which backdrops my identity. And Mexico is a huge country with each state having its own set of diverse communities. And oftentimes we are taught these single narratives as we've seen in these previous questions. So being here has really made me understand that there's diversity within the country as well. And so what this experience has shown me is that the stories of identities are multifaceted, and we should always think critically about the narratives we are told. Nothing is ever linear, and I'm learning to take comfort in that in my identity, but also in the interactions that I have based on the country that I come from.
This is sort of a loaded question for me because I grew up also Mexican American, and it's always been a really big part of my identity. I feel like I really resonate with what Rihanna was saying about always searching for how Mexican am I and how Mexican do I have to be. I was privileged enough to go up visiting my family that lived in Mexico every year, but I had never spent longer than a month and a half in Mexico. And I also tended to stay in a small town, not in Mexico City. Meanwhile, in the United States, I grew up in an area that did not have much diversity. So my experience has also been shaped a lot by that. And before talking about the bilateral relationship, I think it's also worth mentioning that Mexico has a lot more than what is spoken about in the United States, specifically in terms of like culture, celebrations, cuisine, and economics. And now that I've lived in Mexico City for close to 2 years, I can say that the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the US is quite strong and intertwined. And it definitely flows both ways. And there's a lot of elements at play. I think a big change in recent years in Mexico is American migration to Mexico and the gentrification of cities. I also think something we don't hear about is that Mexican migration to the US decreased after 2008, the housing crisis. I was also able to complete fieldwork in Tijuana for my Fulbright, and the bilateral relationship is incredibly strong in these border cities, specifically through like communal workers and students, and you can see it in the cuisine, language, and education there. And I know that my experience right now is also greatly shaped by the changes in the US administration, but I continue to believe, and perhaps even more so than my Fulbright and before my Fulbright, that this strong and cohesive bilateral relationship is in the interest of both countries. And lastly, I want to touch on the fact that my Fulbright has also given me the opportunity to dive into the American dream for Mexican immigrants to the US and Mexican Americans. I've actually met more Mexican Americans here than I ever did in the US, but it's also shaped my experience. One thing that I wasn't expecting to experience in Mexico was this sort of anti-Mexican American death. I've had various comments through my last 2 years about, ay, porque es tan bueno tu español, or even a comment made by a professor about, esta compañera apenas está aprendiendo español académico, which I never told her that I came from abroad. So those have definitely been challenges I wasn't expecting to navigate here. If I could speak better, I could elaborate on it, but I've always felt very Mexican American, and my time here has further cemented my belief that I really feel very 50-50.
So for me, when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about it as a white person from the United States, looking at other white people from the United States. And I think your point on gentrification is huge. So I spent the last 6 months living with a host family in the north of the city and hearing about their experiences of both of the parents grew up in Mexico City and how much it's changed, not just in the last decade, but in the last 4 years since the pandemic. Looking at neighborhoods, obviously, like La Condesa, La Roma, even San Rafael, Santa Maria la Ribera, Navarte, how they have changed radically in the last 5 years. Polanco, how people have been, like whole neighborhoods have essentially been pushed out, how rents have quadrupled. Because there's now the presence of the American dollar and the possibility of remote work. And so that was a huge thing for me. I did not know about US immigration to Mexico, especially to Mexico City, and to see how irresponsible other people from the US are with their dollar and what it can mean to earn in dollars and live in a country that pays in pesos, and how different gentrification can affect countries internationally. When I think about gentrification prior to coming here, I always thought about it within cities, right? Nationally. But internationally, I think it works so much faster and is so much more insidious. So that was a huge point for me. The other thing is that what I knew about Mexico before, I knew like the north of Mexico. That's where my friends were from, that the music that I consumed, a lot of the media that I consumed was centered around the borderlands, was centered around North Mexico. And so for me coming to Mexico City, I had no expectations, and I have been nothing but delighted with the richness of the food, the culture, learning so much. I'm a guest and I am incredibly happy and agradecida, grateful to be here because it has been such a beautiful experience for me and beyond anything that I could have imagined.
I would definitely echo that sentiment of gratitude. I also just want to add, when you're a foreigner traveling to another country, whatever your identities are, racial, with regard to gender, sexuality, that country will present itself and open itself up to you very differently. My experience as a man living in Naucalpan or in Greater Mexico City is very different than that of my peers here. I think I took some classes on Mexico and the United States before coming here, and every day I feel like I'm learning something new. and I feel like I almost have a lot more questions than I do answers. I remember I took one class, and we talked about this idea of like the two Mexicos. In 1968, you're watching a movie with El Santo. El Santo arrives at his house. He has a record player, a silver car. His wife or girlfriend is wearing a very expensive dress. At the same time, we know in that same year, there are student and union movements going on at UNAM, and there's a lot of people struggling, and there's kind of political repression. And so I came here to Mexico with this idea that there were two Mexicos, and every day I feel like I'm finding that there's like another sector of Mexican society that's distinct and really kind of challenges me. And with that, I kind of wanted to praise, I work at UNAM Fesacatlan, which is like a wonderful community, and I feel like I'm surrounded by very smart people, and they have a lot of really awesome attitudes and opinions that I wish we ourselves had more reverence for in the United States. I don't know if these attitudes are indicative of all of Mexico or most of Mexico, but some to my eye are, there seems to be kind of a consensus around public education in Mexico, around nuclear non-proliferation, and there seems to be a wider spread reverence for sometimes, not all the time, but for indigenous representation and for indigenous discussions about indigenous culture here in Mexico.
Thanks for sharing your perspectives in the U.S.-Mexico relationship with us, the importance of cultural exchange, and the challenges and opportunities ahead have given us much to reflect on. So, in this sense, some of our students had to leave because they have other classes. But I want to ask if you guys have any questions related to education, economy, politics.
Do you want to challenge us on anything? We're very interested in what you all have to say.
I mean, you have some problems. That it's being transmitted on YouTube. I did not. Yes, I'd like to know, you have some problems or some issues because the problems with the Trump government, if you have written your opinions already, so you have some problems. And what happened if someone have helped you you know some of other teachers have problems because these policies.
Yeah, so to start off, we've had an org-wide meeting regarding the future of the program. The current status, as Socorro mentioned before, we have a commission here in Mexico, COMEXes, and because they are in charge of our funds and also just the logistics of our programs, we have that backdrop to kind of have a safety net for Mexico. If you're asking other ETAs and other scholars in other countries, there have been pauses. There have been people who are stuck in these countries because of the funding. But in our case, because we are in Mexico and we have a commission, our current fund and our current program is still in progress and we will be finishing it. However, the future of our program next year, there's going to be a lot of changes. As I mentioned before, the ETAs are going to be cut in half. So the cohort is going to be much smaller and probably a lot more reduced. As of now, we have about 56 ETAs throughout all of Mexico. That might be also reduced to just one in Mexico and half of the number. So that's, yeah, if you're asking about Mexico, that's what we have in our knowledge. Other countries, the media has shown that the funds are changing extremely and we just don't know the future of that.
And I just want to add on very quickly that the withholding of these funds is completely illegal. These funds have already been allocated and approved by Congress. And so my hope is to see the return of these funds to where they actually belong, where they were originally and legally allocated to. I do not know what the future is, but if we decide, the United States government decides to follow the law, then these pauses on funding should be lifted. There are also lots of challenges in court happening right now about international aid, things like USAID, questioning the legality of both Trump and Elon Musk's ability to go in, shut down, and withhold international funding.
Someone else? In Spanish, maybe?
Sí, podemos responder en español también.
Opinions?
Yeah, of course.
Recently on net, you saw the Vice President Vance speaking clearly that the college professor is the enemy. Do you think that toxicity may come here? In your experience, have you ever seen backlash so serious? I've never seen this before in my lifetime. And it's pretty serious that the government regards as a college professor or labels the college professor as the enemy. Do you think this is coming beyond this point?
So this is definitely a very recent phenomenon in the United States phenomenon. I would argue that it is not new. If we look back at the United States during the 1970s with Vietnam, colleges and college students were the agitators, right? Their colleges and universities are typically bastions of critical thought, a lot of times liberal thought, and innovators of new ideas, right? And so I think that it is very scary to hear him say that. Of course, there have been so many comparisons made to this current administration and Nazi Germany, with book bannings, book burnings, and just a complete and terrifying desire for authoritarianism. At the same time, I do believe that while there is a wave of right-wing authoritarianism sort of sweeping over the entire world, as it has been for the last decade, I do not know if it will make its way here. I think there is a possibility in the future, but I feel with the current Mexican government, it is not likely to be as now institutionalized or as much as a talking point as it is in the United States, because so much of that stems from right-wing thought and from a lack of a solid education system within the United States, now made much worse by the dismantling of the Department of Education. So while I could see that being sort of fringe opinions in certain areas of Mexico, I feel that in terms of who owns the power, I don't see that as being as much of a celebrated opinion here as it is currently in the United States, at least not now.
Yeah, I'll touch on that. So I'm doing my PhD after I come back to the US, and it is very alarming. But again, as we've said, it's not new. One important thing I want you guys to pay attention to when you watch the news in the US is how they talk about people protesting. Since Vietnam and today with the Palestinian struggle, people don't refer to them as college students, student protesters. They use the term college kids. College kids, and there is a lot of like infantilizing discourse as though college students are not fully formed adults with wonderful opinions that are learning and are, a college campus is a really rare thing in the US because it's a place that's walkable, diverse, and you're exposed to new ideas. So this infantilization of college students is a serious problem. I think part of the reason this is different in the United States than in Mexico is because one, publicly funded institutions of Mexico like UNAM and other such things are like quite more affordable and economic for people, still out of reach for a lot of people. But I think part of what the right wing and Donald Trump in the United States have figured out is that a lot of Americans have a lot of resentment at even public and state universities for being so expensive and costing thousands of dollars while allegedly being public. And they've tens of thousands, and they've done a good job of redirecting people's rage at that unfortunate fact to resenting academia itself. I'll say two more things. I'm not the most familiar with how tenure faculty works in Mexico. but I understand that tenure track faculty and that question is very different. And I think that is an important part of the equation. In the United States, we're seeing the erosion of tenure, like cargos académicos de permanencia. No, and that is something that I imagine in Mexico, tenure as it exists is, I think, a bit harder to chip away at for those who have secured it. I could be wrong. I will say also, I have seen in some online discourses in Mexico, there does exist like a small bit of anti-academic discourse directed against, kind of public universities as having this reputation of like producing overly liberal students that are always on paro. I, of course, don't believe that, but I do think that this is a thing in unfortunate siloed spaces is existing in Mexico, and I don't think it'll emerge nearly to the same scale as in the United States, though. I'm optimistic on that.
Follow up on that question, I'm a Fulbright scholar, nice to meet you all, and, yeah, great presentation, So I think to follow up on that, do y'all think the Trump administration is anti-science? And if so, what are the implications it has going forward, right? Regarding U.S.-Mexico relations, but also in the U.S. I'm also a PhD student, and there's lots of things else.
I'm happy to speak on this. Okay, so yes, I think pretty obviously the Trump administration is anti most science, and just generally anti-fact. So we've seen that in climate change. Climate change is not an opinion, it is a fact or a denial of a fact. I would also say that when we look at RFK and his opinions on vaccines, especially vaccines and the supposed connection to autism, which does not exist. I'm going to sound like a conservative right now and say, do your own research. If you read any paper besides the one paper that made that opinion famous, you will see that there is no connection between vaccines and autism. But the Trump administration is using incorrect science and misguided public opinion to shut down organizations that, again, provide critical thought. I'll tell you, my friend works at the National Institute of Health, and the National Institute of Health has been banned from publicly announcing the threat of bird flu or avian flu in the United States, although it may become a pandemic. And so that is blatantly anti-science, right? And just the halting of funding related to the National Institute of Health in general, the United States government's decision to remove itself from the World Health Organization, yet again. These are all movements to restrict public access to science, to knowledge, and to deeply, gravely, and immediately endanger U.S. citizens, as we're seeing with the return of measles. Measles, a disease that we had almost completely eradicated. We now have multiple cases within the United States. So I think, yes, completely, incredibly anti-science in a way that is terrifying for many U.S. citizens and citizens globally.
Well, I think it's also important to note that Trump and the American right wing is not only anti-intellectual, it's oftentimes pseudo-intellectual. We see this with these people, commentators such as Jordan Peterson, with Ben Shapiro, and one of the most unfortunate casualties has been transgender children and our conversation around gender. You'll hear a lot of right-wingers in the United States say, but science says there's only two genders. You either have this chromosome or actual, or this chromosome. It's basic biology, is what a lot of like Trumpists will say. But, anyone, if you study advanced biology, you know that sex and gender is much more complicated than this. There are like so many children born intersex. There's also there's hormonally versus chromosomically to be a man or a woman, and oftentimes those can be mismatched. And I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of intersex and trans people really getting left behind in the US because the Trump administration has officially banned government sources from using what are actually very helpful medical terms like assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, which are really just neutral descriptors that doctors use to describe these situations. Yeah, so for sure.
I have a question. Well, we're at university, And of course, our students, some of them are majoring and different programs and so on. And it's normal for people just to think about studying abroad, right? And being Mexican in origin can actually be sometimes scary, especially because of the current scenario. You wonder, is it the right place to go at the moment? I mean, I know you spoke about how important it was to have diversity also in college and to have people actually bring input that could actually make us develop, you know, as humans, not only in terms of countries, right? So what could you tell students, you know, that are probably majoring right now, they're thinking of a mobility program, you know, and the US has a lot of very good universities, and maybe they could feel fearful. What would be a word of advice for them? How could you help them? I mean, we're gonna have USA Today talking about this soon, but what word of advice, piece of advice could you give them?
Yeah, I think it's one thing to say like, yeah, you know, we have, like I mentioned in the response I gave to the previous question of, I'm looking, in my opinion, it's important to look at American universities and see their advocacy initiatives to keep inviting international students. But the fear is valid. I mean, there are students that have applied to programs and are no longer doing that because they are afraid. I think it's completely valid, and I think my only advice, I think being here at the UNAM as an ETA has also opened my eyes up to, unfortunately, those stigmas of, I don't want to go to the US, I'd rather go to Canada. And I think for me, as someone who has had the education I had in the US and this sort of duality of coming from immigrant parents where they were like, no, you need to study in the US and get your degree in the US. It's really interesting, and it's a very conflicting view, but I think my advice is, it's so crucial right now. And although there's no going against the fact that there is racism, it's gonna happen. It's the state of our country right now. But I think for that reason, more than ever, it's super important to continue these international programs. And I think there are resources here as well, that of course we are here to also have like these conversations, but Education USA is one of them. There's people and organizations that want to have international students. As we mentioned throughout this entire presentation, the political rhetoric of what we're seeing is not the sole idea, and that should not be the sole like reason that you don't do something. Especially now in the political climate, it's so important to look at these other organizations that are actually funding and supporting these initiatives. But I think the fear is valid, and if there's something that can be taken away from that, and I think progressed with understanding that we can use that fear. And I'm gonna sound a little bit more like into this like radicalization of it, but I think as someone who's seeing this movement happen, and the fear, as I hear from my students here at the NALT, it's so important to, I think, just step a little bit away from that fear and do it now, because we need it. We absolutely need it.
Another point that I want to make is, if you're not familiar with what the Trump administration is doing right now, it is originally a military strategy called shock and awe, which is essentially you get immersed in a conflict, or in this case, you become president, and you attempt to shock everyone into a state of paralysis. So an example of this could be in World War II, you can say the firebombing of Dresden, Germany, or the atomic bombs in Japan. It is essentially a way of shocking your enemy or any dissenters into submission. And so my advice is the headlines are going to be awful. I'm sure everybody saw the headline of the Trump administration deporting over 200 Venezuelans who previously had protected status to El Salvador, claiming that they were part of criminal organizations. That decision was, before it happened, blocked by a judge. And the Trump administration went through with it anyway. But that is now being challenged in court. A lot of the deportations that the Trump administration is doing are being challenged in court. Their decision to halt funding to USAID is being challenged in court. And so it is a very scary time to be a foreigner in the United States or to be a United States citizen. But the best advice I can give you is to watch how other branches of government, how other people are fighting back, because the headlines are always going to be negative. For the sake of news organizations, that's how they make their money. But we have checks and balances in place. And so the best thing that we can do is not deny the reality, but hope that centuries of checks and balances, centuries of, we can say democracy, right, of republicanism will prevail. And so for me, my focus is on the courts, is on the judicial system, and seeing how increasingly federal judges are working to fight against these executive orders, because that is right now the safety blanket that we have. But seriously, to go to Ree's point, like if you have an opportunity to study abroad and to go to the United States is so much more than the Trump administration. It is so much more than right-wing individuals. It is an incredibly diverse place, and there are millions of people who want to support foreigners living in the US, who want to protect foreigners living in the US. And so I can't speak to anyone's situation specifically, but I know people who are living and working in the United States who are foreign citizens, and their jobs are consulting with lawyers just to protect them, right? They are being given advice from the ACLU, for example, from nonprofits who are saying, I'm here to help you. There are so many people who want to help. I think this is terrifying. I hope it's temporary, and I hope that cooler heads prevail.
I'll add, there have been two big headlines in the past few weeks about international students in the United States. One was a graduate student at Columbia University in New York. There have been a lot of protests there about Israel-Palestine. This graduate student was a permanent legal resident with an American citizen spouse. Their residency has been revoked. And then there was a graduate student at Georgetown who I think similarly organized or was a vocal, we could say pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel activist. So I would just say, you do have to be cautious about how it is if you're organizing or getting involved in social justice movements. Unfortunately, these days, I will say you should look carefully at these different universities, what's going on at them, because they're very different universities in different states. Some of them are very ready to cooperate with the Trump administration and government, and some of them have actually quite impressed me, like the state universities in California. My understanding is they've done a decent job thus far at pushing back, and they seem to still be welcoming institutions for Mexican Americans, Mexicans, and international students of all sorts. So,
Yeah, just to sort of expand on that, I think it's really important to look at the school, and a lot of liberal arts educations, for example, like where I did my undergrad, was sort of revolved around this idea of a global citizen. So their priority for study abroad and receiving international students was very high. So they really valued those students. So I would say, unfortunately, maybe you do have to pick and choose, if you can, where to go, and sort of base off that. Like, yes, my school was in Florida, but it was in Orlando, which is a very blue city. So I think that also means there's more organizations willing to protect the communities and also give you support, like my colleagues are sharing. So that would be my sort of insight.
Well, why do you think Americans elected Trump? Yes, that.
This one, yeah. So this is something that I talk to my students about a lot at IPN, because it's a question that I get a lot. And I think from an international perspective, you are seeing the consequences of an authoritarian leader attempting essentially despotism, right? Like a complete takeover. And that was not the way he marketed himself. So within the United States, when we think of his first administration, the economy was strong. It was pre-COVID, and it was generally, for a lot of Americans financially, a good time. He made a lot of financial decisions, plus COVID, that really impacted the United States negatively. But what we know about the economy is that the decisions made in 1 year do not show their effects until years later. And so during the Biden administration, inflation surged. It was so hard to buy a house. Everything was, especially towards the end of his presidency, incredibly expensive. There were also many international conflicts. Trump was sort of known as the no-war president. This is incorrect. My colleague Jackson made the great point that he exported all of the United States' wars during his first administration. But when you compare that to the Palestinian genocide during the Biden administration, to the war in Ukraine, he's able to twist public opinion around this idea. And so I think that the reason why he won in 2024, for me, the two biggest things that I think of are a combination of racism and sexism. He was running against a woman of color. And so immediately you're going to, if you are a white man running against a woman of color, you're going to win a swath of the population, a percentage. I won't say it's incredibly large, but it made Kamala's fight much harder. And the other thing is that she was vice president during a time that was economically very hard for United States citizens. And so what he was promising was to reduce egg prices, was to reduce gas prices, was to make the United States livable again, to make rents payable again. This is not what he's doing at all, but people were frustrated and beyond frustrated, desperate. And so the Republican Party has a history of being known as the economy party, right? They supposedly have a better understanding of running the economy. If you look at actual statistics, it tends to be Democrats who have better economies under their presidencies, barring pandemics. But he was able to ride on the perception of Republicans as being better with the economy, on him being a man and being a white man, and that carried him to the White House. I don't think that it was necessarily his anti-trans or anti-immigrant rhetoric that spoke to the majority of the country. Definitely in border states, he swung a lot of, I think, Republicans and independents making false claims about the border. But I think really it was a question of who will make my life livable again, and he made the better argument.
So I'll share a little bit of personal family history. My family came to the United States in the 1910s, 1920s. Immediately, the Great Depression hits, and the Democratic Party becomes very popular because the Democratic Party becomes the party of social spending, of public investment, of the New Deal and Nuevo Trato. And it's like the party of building things and like common sense Keynesian economics. And what we've seen is the Democrats were very popular for as long as they were the social spending party from the 40s to the 60s, more or less. They controlled the lower house of our Congress for decades into Ronald Reagan. And under Ronald Reagan, the Republicans kind of finally come back, and the Democrats shift, instead of more to the left, they shift their message more to the right. And President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, comes along and kind of, brings the Democratic Party into this era of neoliberalism, of deregulation, of less social spending, and even under less immigration. And so even under President Obama, I think a lot of Democrats were expecting a lot more in terms of public health care and welfare. And I think a lot of Americans were somewhat disappointed at the Biden presidency, although maybe we could credit it for some things. I think a lot of Americans do not see a clear enough distinction between the opposition party and Trump's party currently in government, in that the Democrats have kind of given up their narratives. When Trump first was running, Democrats would talk about how ridiculous it was to build a wall and to be tough on the border. Today, or recently, we've heard Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden say, no, we're actually better on being tough and secure at the border. And that narrative has kind of shifted, right? I remember in President Obama's book, he says like 5 times in 2008, I know that the government can't solve all of our problems. So I think there is like a problem with the Democratic Party of not being progressive enough, not being bold enough about public spending, and just adopting weaker right-wing positions of the Republican Party of Trump. So.
I'll add just a quick, very short end response, but one thing that I was looking at in my public policy curriculum was also just the rise of the middle class and the parts that make up the middle class and the demographics that make up the middle class. I think a big reason why his campaign was so successful is this question of who's going to fight for the middle class, and but not really understanding again to this idea of political strategies. Sorry, I'm so close. Political strategies and the headlines that are kind of dominating that dominated his campaign. It's really interesting to me to really look at what makes up the middle class and the issues that are making up the middle class and the different sections that make up the middle class. There's lower middle class, upper middle class, and each have a different issues. I've seen it in my own family, and I think the conversations that revolve around that are ongoingly changing in the U.S. And so I think a lot of what he used was a rhetoric of like, I will fight for this aspect, but in reality, that it was completely the opposite, and that's what we're seeing today. But I do think it's a very important area to look at in the U.S. economy, especially with the teen demographic, and to consider who makes up that wealth, that section of the wealth gap in the U.S.
Probably we have time for 2 more questions, 1 more question. English, Spanish. Comentario, inquietud.
Okay, I don't know if you have anything else to add. You guys, I really, really want to thank you for being here and for also answering all this. I think it's not easy, you know, also for you being there and answering all these questions, you know, but I think that precisely, I don't remember who said it, but it's precisely this, you know, what is really, a good scenario for the future, you know, like talking about it, you being here, they being here, and being able to listen to what you have to say also, apart from media and all these things. And well, thank you very much for being here. Nobody else, sure. Okay.
Well, just to emphasize in this point, conversations like this remind us of the significance of dialogue, diplomacy, and cultural understanding in shaping the future of our two nations. So thank you so much, and well, hope to see you around soon. Thank you.
Sorry. I just want to end with this. Also, I'm the ETA here, so if you guys want to talk to me about this ongoingly, I'm here for 2 more months. I love having these conversations, and I hope to visit your classes. But I think, as we all mentioned in this panel, it's definitely a scary time. We feel it being here from cultural ambassadors from the U.S. What does that even mean? So we definitely feel it, and I think, as we've all said, these conversations are so important, and we just don't want to. I think nuance is so important right now. And you may have your ideas of the U.S., but I think we need to be able to have a dialogue about that. It's crucial right now, and it's really important to us. So just thank you for sharing this space with us, and we just really think it's important to have these conversations right now.
I just want to add on to that very quickly, that if you do have a question or a comment, but you don't want to say it publicly, please come find us afterwards. We love to talk, to debate, to hear your perspectives. Truly, this is so exciting for us to be here. Thank you, Ree, for helping making this happen. But yes, please, anything you want to say afterwards, we open ears. We would love to hear it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.